Hi everybody, my name's Tara. I'm the Garden Center Supervisor here at Alaska Mill and Feed, and today we're going to be talking about planting spring bulbs. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that we ask that you keep yourself muted and your video off. There's a chat function, so if you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask them in there, and then I'll give you an answer. As always, if I don't know the answer, I will look it up for you, and then when we send out the recording, I will send out my answer along with it. Before we get going, can everybody hear me okay? Seems like it. All right. So we're going to be talking about planting spring bulbs, and I'm going to be talking about Tuberous Begonias, Dahlias, Freesias, Gladiolas, and Lilies. Okay, so what exactly are spring bulbs? They're sometimes called tender bulbs because they can't survive cold winter temperatures like where we live. They are bulbs that are planted in the spring that can also be called summer bulbs because they bloom in the summer. Bulbs planted in the fall are sometimes called spring bulbs, which gets really confusing because they bloom in the spring. So just to make everything clear, today we're talking about spring planted, summer blooming bulbs. So the term bulbs is often used to describe a whole bunch of different things, including corms, rhizomes, and tubers, as well as true bulbs, but these are all more accurately called geophytes. A geophyte's a perennial plant that has an underground storage organ where the plant holds its energy and water. And geophyte just literally means earth plant. So we're really talking about spring planted, summer blooming geophytes. You probably actually know a lot of geophytes, you just didn't know that's what they were called. So there's tubers like Dahlia, Tuberous Begonia, potato, and peony. There are bulbs like lilies, onions, and tulips. Corms, they're a lot like bulbs, but they're solid. And those are going to be your Freesia, gladiolus, and crocus. And then there's rhizomes like ginger, bamboo, and iris. And we're not talking about any rhizomes today, but they are geophytes, just like tubers, bulbs, and corms. All right, the first one we're going to talk about is one of my very favorite flowers, the dahlia. Dahlias are part of the Asteraceae or Compositaceae family. They're called both, which includes sunflowers, daisies, and dandelions. They're named after a scientist, Anderson Dahl, who called the dahlia a vegetable because you can eat the tubers. I don't generally recommend it, but you could if you needed to. There are currently 42 species of dahlia that we know about and 14 different flower types. And they can be found in pretty much every color except for blue, but they're still working on it. And this is a photo that I took in our greenhouse last summer. So those are some of the dahlias that we were selling here. And this is an example of some of the dahlias that we actually have in the store right now. We have some of these tubers for sale. So there's a pom-pom dahlia called Wizard of Oz. The cactus dahlia, I really like those ones. They're the spiky ones. That kind's called Aloha. There's decorative, which is another type, and this one's called Hawaii. And then there's the dinner plate, which are the really big ones, and this one is Grand Finale. So dahlias can be potted up indoors. About mid-March is a good time. And depending on the size of the tubers that you have, you can pot them in anything from a 4-inch pot to a 6-inch or gallon size pot. Before you plant them, you want to try to identify the eyes on your dahlia tubers. This is where the plant's going to grow from, just like on a potato. The eye is the part where the plant comes out of. The eye is important because you want to plant your dahlia tuber on its side with the eye facing up so that it grows in the right direction. If you can't find the eye and you wind up if you put it in the dirt in a different position, it's likely that geotropism will fix itself and it will start growing up in the right direction. It just might take a little bit longer. If you can't identify the eye, I just bought some Dahlia tubers and I can't find the eyes on them yet. They're not very pronounced. So I'm going to let them warm up and sprout in my house for a couple of weeks. So that's something that you can do. You can divide your Dahlia tubers up when you purchase them, or if you save them from last year and they're in one big clump. You can divide them up, but you want to keep at least one eye per body, and that's the big tuber potato looking part. You're going to plant them in moist soil, but you don't really want to water them until they sprout. So you want to make sure that it's moist so that it doesn't dry out too badly. But Dahlia tubers are really susceptible to rot. So wait to water them if you can until they sprout. And then once you have them potted up, then you can put them under supplemental light and keep them warm. And I thought this was a pretty good illustration of what a Dahlia tuber looks like and how to find the eye on them. I personally find finding the eye kind of tricky. On some of them though, it's fairly obvious. They will be sort of a purplish or a pink color, and they're not going to be down on the big potato tuber looking part. They're going to be higher up on the neck. You can transplant your dahlias outside when the soil reaches about 50 to 60 degrees and after the last frost date. And here in Anchorage, the generally considered safe date to plant things outside is June 1st or Memorial Day weekend. You need to make sure that you harden them off first. And this is the hardening off procedure that you're going to want to use for all of the plants that we talk about. Anything that you grow indoors, you're going to want to harden off before you move it outside so you can get it used to the conditions that it's going to be growing in. So to harden them off, you want to move your plants outside to a nice shaded and sheltered space, and then bring them inside before the evening temperature gets cool. I usually do this for about 2 weeks. And over those 2 weeks, I gradually bring them into a less sheltered, brighter area with more sunlight and maybe a little bit more wind until it matches where they're going to be for the summer. And then once the soil is warm enough where you want to move them into their final spot and there's no danger of frost, you can transplant them into their permanent location. When you transplant, make sure you plant them at the same soil level that they're at in the pot. You don't want to go any deeper, and pick a location that gets full sun and has good draining soil. You can also plant your tubers directly in the ground once the soil has warmed up and there's no frost danger. If you do that, you want to plant your tubers about 4 to 6 inches deep on their sides with the eyes facing up. And this is one of my dahlias that I've been growing for a couple of years. I've been saving the tubers and regrowing them. And last year I did pretty much everything wrong with this dahlia. I didn't look for any eyes. I honestly didn't wait for the soil to warm up. I just sort of stuck it in the garden to see what would happen. And it got to about 3.5 feet tall, and it bloomed the whole summer. So even if you feel like you're doing everything wrong, there is still hope and your dahlia might still bloom. And if you do have more interest in dahlias, I'll be teaching do's and don'ts of dahlias class in March. And I had somebody email me questions, and I think it was for that class, but just in case you're watching this class, I can answer your questions in March for the do's and don'ts of dahlia. So the next one that we're going to be talking about is the Freesia. Freesias are in the Iridaceae family, along with the iris, the crocus, and the gladiolus. They're originally from South Africa, so they like warm, humid weather. Freesias are known for their scent. They're highly scented and they smell wonderful, but perfumers have never actually been able to naturally capture their scent. So anything you get that's Freesia scented is synthetically made. And they're highly valued as cut flowers, and they're often used in bouquets. And I think this is the single mixed Freesia package, and we also currently have this in stock. All right, so Freesias, they like cooler weather, They like to be warm and humid, but they don't like to get too hot. So they do like cooler weather, but they're not frost tolerant and they can't survive our winters. And they also take a long time to bloom, usually 100 to 120 days after they're planted. For our location, you want to plant them indoors at the beginning of March with the intention of putting the plants outside in about mid-June. You want to plant the Freesia corms point up at about 1 inch to 2 inches deep and about 3 to 4 inches apart. A 5 to 6 inch pot is ideal because they do have really long tap roots. And I don't have a good picture of it, but a Freesia corm kind of looks like a little tiny onion. You want to keep your soil moist and shaded until the corms sprout. And then once they're sprouted, you can put them under supplemental light and continue to keep them moist, but you don't want them to be too soggy. And this is a pot that I planted up with some Freesia corms. My pot is 10.5 inches across, and I planted about 10 of them in there. They're pretty close together. This is called overplanting because I want them to look nice and full in there. And if I think that they're struggling, then I might take 1 or 2 out, but I'm going to see what happens. Just like with dahlias, you can move freesias outside after the last frost date and they've been hardened off, but you really want to make sure that these guys don't get any frost at all. Place them in an area that gets full sun and keep them watered so they don't get dry, but they really don't like to have wet feet or to be waterlogged. Freesias might not bloom if the temperatures are over 70 degrees. So like I said, they like warm, but not too hot. And they grow pretty tall, so you're going to want to stake them. It's a good idea to put in a stake or some kind of system that you're going to use to keep them strong when you're transplanting them. And they really, really like to be humid. Okay, so next is the gladiolus. Gladioli is the plural of gladiolus. Sometimes they're just called glads as well. And they were originally called sword lilies. Gladius is Latin for sword, and gladiolus means little sword. It's the same root as gladiator. They make really great cut flowers, and they also grow well in vegetable gardens. So if you want to add some flowers to your vegetable garden this year, a gladiolus might be a good option. And like freesias, they're large flowered and they grow from corms. And then certain species of gladiolus can cause irritation when you handle them. So wear gloves unless you know that you don't have any problems. This is a picture of gladioli corms. So these guys you want to also plant point up. And their bottom, some of them are kind of concave. So just make sure that you plant the pointier side up. You can start them indoors in pots at the end of February, beginning of March, maybe mid-March. It's a good idea to plant a few every week or so that you have a long season of blooms. You're going to want to plant the corms about 4 to 6 inches deep. And depending on the size of the corms. If it's a big corm, then you should plant it a little bit deeper. A good rule of thumb is that you want to plant a bulb or a corm or whatever it is about 2 to 3 times deeper than it is wide. You want to use a pot that's deep enough so that the corms have at least 2 inches of soil below them, so that the roots have something to go into. And you can also start them out in trays if you have a whole bunch of them and you don't want to place them in single pots. You can fill up a tray with holes with the soil medium, and then you can just sort of set them in there, nestle them down in the soil, and then transplant them out later. And as with all of these plants that we're talking about today, they all really like well-draining potting soil. And they all want to be kept moist, but don't soak them. And then you can put them near a bright light source. And this is how the corm develops. So you can see about in April, in a lot of places, they can plant them out in April. That's just how the corm looks, and the new growth is at the top, and then it continues to grow, and it uses up the old corm, but the new one grows over it. And then there's little cormels, which look like kind of little tiny bulblets that grow around the side of it. You can also directly plant them outdoors about 2 weeks before the last frost date. You want to make sure that they get full sun, full afternoon sun, and they're protected from the wind. And this is because they get really tall, so you don't want them to get thrashed about by the wind. They really like rich, well-drained soil. And like I said, if your soil makes good vegetables, then the gladioli will also be really happy. Just like planting in pots, you're going to want to plant them 4 to 6 inches deep. And if you're planting a bunch of them together, they look really great in rows, but you want to spread them out about 6 to 8 inches apart. And harden off the indoor potted gladioli 2 weeks before the last frost date, before you transplant them outside. And you can actually plant the starts deeper than they are in the pot. So you can go up a couple inches on the green shoot that's coming out. I've even read that you can go as far as 5 inches. So if a shoot is 5 inches tall, you can actually bury that shoot. And that's because these are really tall plants and they're just going to keep growing up. And if you bury them a little bit deeper, it makes them more stable. They can take a really long time to bloom, at the minimum 60 to 90 days after planting. Here in Anchorage or in Alaska in general, we usually get blooms in about August. And they don't like to be planted near woody shrubs or trees, and you're definitely going to need to stake any of the taller varieties. If your gladioli have really streaky leaves, or if your flowers aren't opening, then thrips are probably the problem. Thrips are really tiny insects and they're very hard to see. But if you think that your gladioli or any of your plants have them, you can shake some of the flowers or the leaves over a white piece of paper, and then you'll be able to see what falls out. And a 10x magnifying glass can be really helpful. Thrips are pretty tricky and they can be very difficult to treat without chemicals, unfortunately. There's ladybugs and green lacewings that feed on them. You can try preemptively spraying them with an insecticidal soap. But if they're still attacking and you really want to save your gladiolus flowers, then you might have to use an insecticide such as 7. So you'll have to decide if you want to use an insecticide like that, or if you want to save your gladiolus flowers. All right, next up is the lily. Lilies are one of the most popular flowers in the world. On something that I read recently, they're the #4 most popular, I think. They belong to the Liliaceae family, which has over 600 species, and the tulip is included in there. There's Asiatic lilies and Oriental lilies that people most often talk about. And the Asiatic lilies are from mainland Asia, and the Oriental lilies are from Japan. Lily bulbs are imbricate bulbs, and tulip bulbs are tunicate bulbs. So the lily bulbs, they have scales, but they don't have a paper coating. And the paper coating is a tunicate that protects them. And so that papery part that's on a tulip bulb is the tunicate, and the lily bulb doesn't have that. So they're a little bit more fragile. And because they're more fragile, you want to be gentle with them as the scales can peel off. Lilies grow really well up here, and when you start them indoors, you want to plant them in a 6-inch pot with well-draining potting soil. And go ahead and plant them pretty deep, 4 to 6 inches, or at least twice as deep as the bulbs are wide. But make sure that there's a couple inches of soil under them. And don't let them get soggy when you water them, and place them under lights and keep them warm. I've seen that a lot of people start growing them in March. You might be able to get away with April as well. They can be hardened off and transplanted in May to early June. And you're going to want to plant them in full sun, but they also do pretty well in part shade. And I know of some people that have lilies that grow in almost full shade or dapple shade. So if you have a spot that you want to try to fill in with some color, but it's shady, then lilies would be a really good thing to try. You're going to want to protect them from the wind because they can get pretty tall. And they like a pH of about 5.5 to 6.5, which is a little bit lower than the other plants that we've talked about. So you don't want to add any lime or anything like that to your soil when you're going to have lilies there. Let's see. Yep, they can grow tall and they may require staking. The Asiatic lilies, they're the tiger lilies that you see a lot. They're reliably hardy in Alaska, and they go down to a zone 3. But the Oriental lilies can be pretty tender, like a zone 4, but more often a zone 5. A lot of people have good luck overwintering the Oriental lilies, but to be safe, I would dig them up and then store them in pots for the winter. And you want to put them in a cool but frost-free spot. So you can pot them up in the winter time and then put them in your basement or someplace cool. All right, then we have the Tuberous Begonia, very popular one. The Begonia genus is in the family Begoniaceae, and they have more than 1,800 species. So there's a whole lot. They can be separated into 3 main categories: fibrous rooted, rhizomatous, and tuberous begonias. The fibrous rooted ones, they include the semperflorens or the wax begonias. That's something that we grow here as an annual, but they're typically grown from seed. So we do have those in our garden center, but they're not ones that you're going to start from tubers or bulbs. Tuberous begonias are very popular though, because they have really beautiful flowers and they come in a very wide variety. You get lots of different colors and forms from them. And this is a Begonia Odorata, and we do have the tubers for these ones here. And these are a few of the different varieties that we have in stock right now. The Begonia crispa marginata. Crispa means curly, and it has the curly margins or the curly edges on it. Begonia rose form is fairly self-explanatory. They look like roses. Begonia fimbriata. Fimbriata means like feathery or fringed. And then the Begonia picotee. And the picotee is where the edges are a different color than the main petal, and they kind of bleed into, the color bleeds into the main petal color. And these are all ones that we had in stock as of this morning. Okay, so Begonia tubers are pretty wild looking. I think they look like little tiny baby hedgehogs laying on their backs. They're bowl shaped, and you want to plant them with the hollow side up. So you plant them like you could eat out of the bowl. You might see these small pink bumps or sprouts in the bowl, and those are going to be the stems of the begonia. You want to start these tubers in pretty small pots, 3 to 4 inches. If you're starting a lot of them at once, then you could use flats with holes like you can with the gladiolas. You want to lightly cover the tuber with soil, but only a 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep. And a lot of people, when they plant these, they don't even cover up that concave area. And you want to make sure not to let water collect in there. They're really susceptible to rot. So you want to pre-moisten your soil and keep it moist, but don't get it soggy, and just water it really sparingly because they will rot very easily. Once you have them potted up, you can place your tubers near a bright window or light, and then a heat mat or a warm spot will make them grow a little faster. For your begonias, when the stems reach about 1 inch tall, which should take about a month, you want to repot them into a larger container, so move up to about a 5 or a 6 inch pot. And you're going to provide supplemental lighting so that they don't get too leggy. So you can put them under a grow light. It's something stronger than a window. And for these ones, if you have a small tuber, your plant will be smaller. If you have a large tuber, you will have a larger plant, but the flower size is actually affected by how many stems there are. So you want to thin the shoots out when they're about 3 inches tall. So when they get 3 inches tall, you want to take them down, use a pair of snippers, don't pull, or I guess you could pinch, but I think snippers are a little bit cleaner. For a small tuber, you only want about 2 to 3 stems, and then for a large one, 3 to 6 stems is okay. There are varieties, however, that are grown for the quantity of flowers and not the size of the flowers. So if you want your plant to have lots of flowers and you don't mind if they're small, then don't thin the stems on those ones. Just like with all the others, you're going to plant outside after the last frost date, but only after hardening off for at least 2 weeks. Begonias like shady spots, but not full shade. So dappled shade is good, or partial shade. They like early morning or late afternoon direct sun, but they need indirect or dappled light otherwise. So they don't like that really hot noonday sun. They only want a couple hours of direct sun a day. They are very fragile, so you want to keep them sheltered from strong winds. If you live in Turnagain or in a windy part of Hillside, then they aren't the right hanging basket flowers for you, probably, unless you have a really sheltered spot. As with everything else that we're talking about, they like the well-drained soil, and make sure you keep them moist, but they don't like having wet feet. They can be kind of tricky because they hate being dry, but they also hate being too wet. So you have to keep them in that sweet spot. And these ones do really well if you bottom water them. They don't really like it too much if they get the foliage wet. There's a lot of information out there. The UAF Cooperative Extension has a publication called Growing and Overwintering Fuchsia, Geranium, Dahlia, and Tuberous Begonia. And it's really helpful. We have it here in the store, but it's free. You can download it from the Cooperative Extension website as well. And they have a lot of really great information. There's several online Alaska gardening forums and local groups that can give you advice from growers in your area. And then we also have a lot of great people here at the store who can give you advice. That's my email address posted. And if you have any questions, you can send them to me if I can't answer them here. And I have a question. Can you talk about how to save and regrow Dahlia tubers? So that's not a topic that I'm going to talk about too much today. I'll go over it a lot in the Dahlia class that I'm teaching next month. But basically in the fall, you want to dig up your Dahlia tubers after the first killing frost. So you want to let the plant die back a little bit, and then you can dig them up, and you want to rinse them off and just with plain water and let them dry a little bit, and then you're going to package them up in some people use vermiculite or pine shavings. Those ones are good so that they can overwinter. And I'll go into that more in depth in the Dahlia class. That's a really good question. Does anybody have any other questions about anything I touched on or didn't talk about today? We do have all of these variety, well, we have representations of all of these plants in the store today. We got our first shipment of geophytes on Wednesday, and we will be getting another shipment shortly. So I think that the only thing we're really missing is a lot of lilies. We only have one variety of lily right now. All right, and I have iPad 8 is raising their hand. And I would love to answer your question if you want to type it into the chat. The question is, should we fertilize and how often? You don't need to fertilize when you first plant them up inside because they've got everything that they need in their little tuber or bulb. But putting them outside, once you transplant them, a lot of people will use bone meal, and that's something that you can use. You want to use a low nitrogen fertilizer. And how often is not an answer that I can give clearly for each of them. People have different methods of fertilizing, and it depends on the kind of fertilizer that you use. So if you use an organic fertilizer, generally they are going to be slower to release, and so they kind of last a little bit longer. If you're using a more synthetic fertilizer, then you might need to fertilize them more often. But that is a really good question. All right, so if there aren't any more questions right now, please feel free to send me an email. Just give me a couple of days to answer it, as I'm not by computer very often, but I will get back to you, I promise. And thank you so much for listening today.